Of course, we're still in Reconstruction. I've finished like the main part of Reconstruction up to before, I guess, we call Radical Reconstruction, which that kind of starts taking place closer to 1870. So that's mostly what I'll get in today and talk about. And of course, there's, I guess, two things I'll talk about first with Radical Reconstruction. One is the program that the radical Republicans decided on against Andrew Johnson's. But Andrew Johnson, had his own plans, which were more lenient toward the South, like Lincoln was thinking. And they came up with a series of acts that basically were passed over the vetoes of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was really a weak president. He was a Democrat, remember. And you can see here they had different parts to it, like 5 different parts that were part of what they call the Reconstruction Act of 1867. The first thing was they took all the southern states that had not passed the 14th Amendment. They basically put them in military districts controlled by military governors. So they had to go through like a military reconstruction. Tennessee had actually agreed to the 14th Amendment, so they were basically didn't have to go through that. I do have a map showing you how they broke it up, but Texas and Louisiana was in one district, Arkansas and Mississippi in one, Alabama, Georgia, Florida was in one. Looks like South Carolina and North Carolina, it was in one district, and then you had also military district of Virginia was separate. So anyway, that's how they divided it up initially. And then also other provisions they put too in the that Reconstruction Act was they tried to deprive ex-Confederates of the right to vote or the hold office, which for several years, 5-10 years or so, a lot of Confederates couldn't hold office or vote, which was a lot. I forget how many it was exactly, but as many as maybe almost 200,000, I think, were deprived of voting or hold office. Also, then African Americans were given political rights in the South, like a right to vote. A lot of them had a right to run for office politically as well. So that was the third provision they put in it. Fourth provision they put in it too was they had to basically force the southern states to draft constitutions that were in favor of freedmen having a right to vote and hold office, and so they couldn't come back into the U.S. be reconstructed until they had done that. And then, of course, the last thing, it's part of why the whole military reconstruction happened, was the southern states then had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which, of course, gave African Americans citizenship. We've, I think, talked about that already. I think that is on that slide here. And eventually they would have to ratify the 15th Amendment too as well. But yeah, the main one they had to ratify was basically that one right there, which is the 14th Amendment. I think it was only for males. I think later now it's females, but I know at the time when they were thinking about citizenship, it's mostly men that they're talking about. Same thing with voting. Men got the right to vote. Not women. It's one of the things that sucks about that. But so that was initially a radical reconstruction, and so each state was like ruled by like a military governor that was appointed by the federal government. But how many troops were actually in occupation in the South? It wasn't that many. I think they think maybe 30,000 may have like been involved in the military reconstruction of the South. So not that many federal troops were really there when it was going on. Then, of course, next thing, of course, that happened that's very famous, is that Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868 because, Johnson was trying to stop the radical Republicans from doing military reconstruction. And because Johnson was trying to interfere with it. In fact, he actually tried to restrict a lot of the military governors from doing their job. and he was more sympathetic to the Southerners, especially Democrats in the South. And so Johnson was impeached over this thing that's called the Tenure of Office Act, which was an act passed in 1867 by the Radical Republicans. And the Tenure of Office Act, what it basically did was it said that the president could not dismiss important civil officers without the Senate's consent. So there's a certain position in the government, federal government, he couldn't just fire him unless he got consent from the Senate. It's actually unconstitutional now, but at the time it was passed by the Republicans. And so what happened, if you know about it, was the Republicans got real angry because what occurred was Johnson decided to fire the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton. Stanton was a ally of the Radical Republicans in Congress. And so that led to the House of Representatives, filing articles of impeachment, which they saw in the video was in February of 1868. And that would lead to an impeachment trial that would last like 2 or 3 months, from March to about May of 1868. And I think I've got some slides on this somewhere that I've got right here. Yeah, so they thought he had violated it, the Tenure of Office Act, and so that became the reason for it. If you read what the Constitution says, more or less, it says, Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, it wasn't treason, it wasn't bribery. So what was his high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, a lot of it was political. Saw in the video they talked about that. And more or less it was about who was, in control of Reconstruction. Congress wanted more of a harsher Reconstruction. Johnson wanted more of a, more liberal or lenient type Reconstruction. And that's what it was. They're kind of loggerheads over that. And whatever Congress tried to do, he would veto it, and they would just override it. So the Senate fell short, though. The guy that preceded it over it, by the way, was the Supreme Court Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase. He was in charge of it. And there's only been 3 presidents that have been impeached. Of course, besides Johnson, you've got Bill Clinton back in the 1990s. And then, of course, most recently, Donald Trump, was impeached as well. And of course, all 3 failed. Well, that's something like that. And so all 3 failed. And so no president's ever been impeached and found guilty. It's kind of hard to do because you got to have 2/3 vote. And if if you're whatever political party you're in is in power and they have a lot of power in the Senate, it's kind of hard to do that. So anyway, that's basically what happened with his impeachment and all that. But it weakened him. Johnson wasn't very powerful after that. And what's interesting, what happened was 4 days later, if you know what happened, was the Republicans decided to nominate Ulysses S. Grant for president because they were concerned that keeping the White House or not, if they could. And so Grant came in, and Grant didn't really care as much about Reconstruction. He pretty much went along, promised pretty much to continue with military Reconstruction, but Grant campaigned on different themes. One you can see there was that he campaigned on a theme which was waving the bloody shirt, which you may have heard that term being used, or vote as you shot or vote how you shot. And he was saying basically that if you had supported the Union side, the Northern side in the war, you ought to vote for me, Grant. He also had another slogan, too, when he ran for president, which is famous. I'll put it on the screen for you. But it was, let us have peace. That was the name of it, basically. Yeah, let us have peace. And so a lot of people voted for him, not just whites, but African Americans in droves. And he got about, I think, 500,000 African Americans voted for Ulysses S. Grant. And that's part of why he won the election in 1868, was because of the African American vote, believe it or not. 1872, he ran on another slogan, which is "Grant us another term," which is kind of U.S. as in U.S. Grant, kind of a play on that. Although Horace Greeley, who was an editor of the New York Times, actually New York Tribune, said it should be also. The slogan should have been "Turn the rascals out," because, of course, they find out later. We'll talk about it now, but Grant ends up being this really corrupt president. His administration was one of the most corrupt in American history. And we'll talk about that later. He supported the Radical Reconstruction thing and all of that. But he wasn't as staunch into it like some of the radical Republicans were and all of that. Yeah, I've got a slide here saying it's one of the most corrupt presidencies of all time. Yeah, that's true about that. And he's basically the president that they think pretty much starts later, what is called the Gilded Age, which we probably won't get into that much today. We're kind of starting on that period. The Gilded Age is a period of American history from 1870s to like the 1890s, and it's a period of corruption, but it's also a period where the United States expands as a power, and there's like westward expansion towards California and all that. But we'll get into that later, more about that. What we want to talk about more is, so we talked about that already. I want to get into and discuss what happened with Reconstruction in the South because of the military Reconstruction that's going on. And so the Republicans, because of the fact that the radicals have taken over Congress, they have all these allies that take over the South. For about 10 years or so, a lot of the South is controlled by mostly three groups: carpetbaggers, Scalawags, and African Americans. They pretty much have total control over the South. Well, first talk about the carpetbaggers and who they are. They dominated the most. I would say 2/3 of the people that controlled the South during Reconstruction were carpetbaggers. I've got other slides to show you about the carpetbaggers. The carpetbaggers were northern-born white Republicans. They came down to the South after the war was over. They took advantage of the South because of the fact that the Confederacy had collapsed. The South was in just disaster. Everything was destroyed. A lot of land was just sitting there. Nobody doing anything with it. A lot of the Confederates couldn't have any power, and so they took advantage of this. And it enabled them to hold office, control the vote. They control a lot of businesses. They bought up also a lot of land. So a lot of them took advantage of the situation after the Civil War. And they're called carpetbaggers because they were seen as these people that kind of like fly-by-night adventurers that came to the South. And they've had these suitcases that were made of like a carpet material. So hence the name carpetbagger. Hence it came. Here's kind of another picture of what it looked like. It looked like carpet on your floor or whatever, but it was like a bag. Strange. And Horace Greeley, who I mentioned earlier, the New York Tribune, said a lot of the carpetbaggers were stealing and plundering. They were basically corrupt, and they took advantage of a lot of African Americans in the South, like ripped them off and stuff like that. He said a quote. He said that the carpetbaggers were stealing and plundering, many of them with both arms around the blacks and their hands in their rear pockets, seeing if they cannot pick a paltry dollar out of them. So they're trying to rip off African Americans, and on top of that, they were basically ripping off like the states and stuff, like stealing money and stuff like that. But then you had some that were honest that came to the South to help people out. refugees of the war, help out African Americans, found schools, and things like that. So you had some people that did good things that came to the South, but there's a lot of them that were kind of scoundrels that were kind of took advantage of the situation. It's kind of like after a hurricane, you get these people that come in that aren't insured and they try to take advantage of people. It's kind of like that, I guess. So that happens like after Katrina, I know, as an example. Of course, that's kind of the view, that a lot of Southerners, the carpetbagger, these scoundrels coming down here. A lot of images kind of look like that. Pictures of them. Like this is a famous cartoon picture of some of the carpetbaggers. A lot of the white Southerners hated them, because a lot of them couldn't have any power and stuff like that at the time. Then you have what they call scalawags. Scalawags were Southern-born white Republicans, and these were men, I guess mostly, that had supported the North during the war, and they got a lot of power too. The scalawags as well. So they were Republicans. So the carpetbaggers and the kind of scalawags kind of ganged up to control a lot of the power in the southern states afterwards. And a lot of Southerners thought they were kind of had betrayed the South and didn't support the Confederacy. And so they looked down upon them also as well. They also tried to help out African Americans also as well. And overall, most of I'd say 2/3 of the politicians in the South during at least the first 10 years of Reconstruction were mostly carpetbaggers and scalawags. In 1868, 4 governors, 10 U.S. senators, 20 U.S. representatives in the South were all carpetbaggers. So a good chunk of them. Also, African Americans held office a lot too. It's realized too as well. There's a bunch of them that held office. I think I've got a slide here showing that. Of course, they had right to vote, but a lot of them who were Republicans, they elected like over 600 state legislatures. African Americans had in a lot of the southern states. They even had 16 congressmen, like in the U.S. Congress, that they had mostly in the House of Representatives. They had 2 state senators too as well, both from Mississippi. Hiram Revels is the most famous of the black politicians that came to power during Reconstruction. And he was, I think he was considered the first African American to hold a Senate seat in the U.S. Congress. Hiram Revels from Mississippi. I think he was from actually North Carolina. He's from North Carolina originally. And then Blanche Bruce, who was from Virginia originally. He was a runaway slave originally. Was also a senator of Mississippi as well. And you've, of course, probably from Louisiana, if you're from here, you've heard of PBS Pinchback, right? He was a lieutenant governor in the 1870s. And what happened was the governor of Louisiana, his name was Henry Warmoth, was impeached. You know about this. And Pinchback became the 24th governor of Louisiana. This is in the 1870s. So I think he was the only African American governor, I think, in the South, whatever at the time. But he's, of course, famous for us, Louisiana. So, but a lot of us exaggerated the amount of African Americans that were in like Congress, and there weren't as many as they sometimes claim or whatever. But a lot of that would kind of go away once the whites came back into power. And a lot of the right to vote is going to be taken away also as well. That's the next thing I want to talk about, what happened, of course, in the South, if you know about it. They had, of course, the formation of these white supremacist groups that followed in the South. And a lot of these were secret societies that were created because a lot of Southern whites were angry with the North, African Americans. They didn't really have any political rights or right to vote. Most of them were ex-Confederates. And so a lot of them joined these secret societies in the 1860s. The most notorious, as you know, was the famous Ku Klux Klan, and which was originally founded in 1867 in Pulaski, Tennessee. It was actually founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was an ex-Confederate cavalry general. He was the first Grand Wizard, although later he regretted it. I think he regretted later about joining it. Actually repudiated it later, the Ku Klux Klan. Most people don't know that. But they had all kinds of different versions of it. The Pale Face, as you can see, the Knights of the White Camellia, I think was popular in Louisiana, the White Brotherhood. And they would dress up in these uniforms that were like ghosts, wearing masks, sheets, not just to cover up their identity or whatever, but also too, the other reason why they did it was they were trying to act like they were ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. They come back to life, and so they thought that would terrorize people and stuff like that. So it was kind of militant. They would ride around on horses, and they would first they'd usually warn you, and mostly the Ku Klux Klan went after those that were pro-Republican, like Scalawags and carpetbaggers, and also after African Americans as well. They used different types of tactics to try and prevent them from voting and from holding office. Obviously, they would have these, I guess, rallies that they would hold. Like, I don't know if they did this back in the Reconstruction era, but I know like around World War I, the 1920s, they would start having Ku Klux Klan rallies and stuff like that. But they would have cross burnings. They would burn a cross on your front lawn. They lynched people, like African Americans and other probably Republicans. Physical violence, threatened people, beat people up. They would burn down people's homes. They burned down churches in the South. So they were quite a problem, the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan's been around multiple times. It's really been there's been 3 waves of the Klan. The Klan first, peaked about 1870. So maybe around 500,000 white Southerners were probably in the Ku Klux Klan originally, but eventually later broke up, of course. And in the 1920s, that's when it was really at its peak. 1925, there were actually 5 million people that were in the Ku Klux Klan at one point, not just in the South, but all over the United States. It was in the North, it was out West, and they weren't just anti, say, black or whatever. They also didn't like immigrants. They hated Catholics. They hated Jews. Groups like that. So they were kind of like this white supremacist group. And there's actually a case in the 1920s where they marched on Washington. You can actually watch video of them marching through the streets of Washington. It's really crazy how powerful the Ku Klux Klan was at one point. The 60s, it came back because of the civil rights movement, in the South, but it never was really that big like it used to be. See, in the 60s, 40, 50,000 maybe were in it. Now today, it's only got a few thousand. They always talk about these white supremacists that are around today, but there's not that many of them around. There seems to be more radical left more than the right now today. But what happened to the Ku Klux Klan? The original one? The original one was broken up due to the so-called Force Acts, which you see there. They're called either Force Acts or Enforcement Acts, or some people call it the Military Enforcement Acts. These were a series of 3 acts that were passed by Congress to prevent violence against African Americans. And it made it illegal for people to prevent people from voting, using violent force, scare tactics, bribery, things like that. And of course, it included Grant. Under President Grant, they sent U.S. troops down to the South to enforce a lot of these acts. And a lot of people were arrested for it. They broke up the Ku Klux Klan and all that. And so that's part of why the Klan after 1871 declined and wasn't really that powerful until really more closer to World War I. So the Klan kind of broke up and it wasn't really that big until later. The other reason why it broke up the Klan too was because of this. They had this Amnesty Act they passed in 1872. What that did was it basically pardoned a lot of African Americans. Not excuse me, it pardoned a lot of ex-Confederates in the South. I think it's like 160,000 or more were actually pardoned at one point and given the right to vote in the hold office. And so what happened because of that, that's the bad thing about it, was it led to the end of Reconstruction. And so what happened within a few years after that was the Democrats started taking back control of the southern states. The Democrats that came in and took power were sometimes called the Redeemers because they felt they were redeeming themselves for the fact that the North tried to take away their political rights and power. And so what's going to happen, I'll get to it later, but there's going to be the New South comes in and you'll see how African Americans start to get disenfranchised. They lose their political rights, right to hold office, right to vote. They even start segregating everything in the South. And that all started, they think, after the Reconstruction would end. I'll get to it later, but officially Reconstruction really wouldn't end until the 1876 presidential election. You'll see later there's going to be kind of a compromise between the Republicans and the Democrats. And eventually the federal government will basically remove its forces, and that'll lead to the real end of Reconstruction, which Reconstruction ends about 1877, about. All right, so next I need to talk about what they call the rise of the New South, which, became more racially segregated, of course, and of course it led to the outcome, which was the end of Reconstruction. You can see the years for the New South is about 1877 to 1980. So from the end of Reconstruction to about World War I is the period of the New South. It add in some stuff in there about there's a slide here I need to add in about talking a little bit about the New South, about what it is. Yeah, the New South was more of a diversified area of the United States. It still had agriculture. Agriculture, is still one of the main economies in the South. You drive anywhere around Louisiana, Mississippi, they still grow a lot of crops, sugarcane, whatever. So yeah, that's something that's still there. But they did begin to diversify into other industries. Like if you go to Birmingham, they started developing a lot of iron and steel, tobacco in Virginia, North Carolina, coal industries in the eastern part of the country. Cotton in the Southwest became big after the war, especially in Texas. And of course, there are some lumber industries. A lot of textile mills. I think up to like over 600 something textile mills sprang up after the war. Like I talked about Birmingham with their steel industries there. Birmingham was sometimes called the Pittsburgh of the South. Also railroads more than doubled since the Civil War. So they started building a lot of railroads all over the South, but they still rely on cotton a lot. Cotton still was one of the big industries of the South until they had that boll weevil epidemic, if you know much about that. But then the other thing that happened was there was a lot of changes in agriculture. Like in the South, they started going to new farming practices where they went to tenant farming and sharecropping, and that was something new that occurred in the New South. Also, I'll get to it a little later, but the other thing that happened, of course, was, like I said, the South became segregated. The North was too, also segregated, but they say it started more in the South, and so you got the rise of Jim Crow laws. Whites and black Southerners are kind of segregated from each other. Schools are segregated, transportation systems, businesses, everything gets segregated over time. Of course, other thing happened too in the South, which I don't have in that little thing there slide, was that, also the South became more urbanized. A lot of the South is still, guess a lot of the parts of the South are still rural, but you get a lot of large urbanized cities that start springing up. Some of the biggest cities are Atlanta, Nashville, Richmond, etc. Begin expanding. And so you got a lot of large sized cities in the South that you got now. Dallas, Houston, Southwest, I guess. So all that kind of starts happening during the, so-called New South, as they called it. Now, we were talking about farming. Yeah, farming was something that started to change a lot. They had different kinds of farming. They had what they call tenant farming. Tenant farming was just where a landowner had some land and he rented land to people. And you had to just supply all your equipment to like grow crops. That was kind of a minority of people in the South. Maybe a third of the population of farmers in the South were probably tenant farmers. A lot of farmers were what they call sharecroppers in the South. Sharecropping was a type of farming where the owner basically gave someone a piece of land to work. And it was like just mostly like a laborer, where you basically farmed the land, you provided your labor, and the actual owner provided everything for it. So the crop seed, all the equipment, the horse, the mules, everything was provided. And so you had to buy on credit if you were a sharecropper. And a large percentage of African Americans in the South were sharecroppers. I think it was close to 80% actually worked the land that way as a farmer. And it was almost like a form of economic bondage where you could never really get out of debt because you always owed money to the landowner. So it's like economic bondage rather than physical slavery type bondage. And so that became the main form of farming that took place overall. And by 1900, 85% of sharecroppers were African American. That's a good bit in the South. Tenant farming was more like 1900, 36%. Or 35%, I guess. Well, 36% of whites and African Americans were tenant farmers, looks like it, total. So that's how they mostly farmed in the South. But some people owned their own land. Like there was cases where some African Americans, a small amount, were able to buy land after the Civil War ended. And there were some that did that, that owned some land. But it was more of a minority overall. So anyway, and here's a map showing you like sharecropping, percentage of it. And you can see, look at Louisiana, certain areas, like especially in the eastern part of Louisiana, looks like a good bit where sharecropping in these areas, right, like the middle of Louisiana, right here, probably growing like sugarcane and cotton predominantly. You can see areas where, like in the blue, if you see blue areas, that's the area where it's more concentrated, where there's a lot of sharecropping going on. So it's a good bit. And it kept some people in poverty because of it, for a long time still. Then, of course, the other thing that's, very famous, about the post-Reconstruction period is the fact that African Americans got disenfranchised, like in the South. Also happened in the North, too, as well. And so you had a case where in the South, they started passing a lot of laws, constitutions that were in favor of disenfranchisement of African Americans. They did it in different methods. I think by the 1880s, 1890s, you had a lot of states started doing this. Mississippi, Tennessee, other states, even Louisiana did in the 1890s. They passed constitutions that did all this stuff at one point. And got some slides here to show you. Of course, one of the most famous things they did was they passed a poll tax. I don't know if you know what a poll tax is. It's been around. I think in Europe they had poll taxes, like in France and other countries. And a poll tax is a tax to vote. It's like a head tax almost, where you would have to pay a certain amount, and if you couldn't pay it, you couldn't vote. They had this for years, poll taxes. I forget when they got rid of it, but it was around, I want to say, up until like the 19th or up to the early 20th century. They had them pretty much as a whole. They had some kind of literacy tests you had to take where if you couldn't read and write, you couldn't vote. So not just being able to sit there and write, like can you sign your name or write something, they would actually literally come up with these tests that were ridiculous, like a test you couldn't pass, basically. Or it was like a test where you had to go in and you recite the Constitution of the United States of America. And you're like, yeah. So you couldn't do it. So you couldn't register to vote. And so that stopped a lot of African Americans from being able to vote. So you couldn't pay the tax because you were poor. And then these literacy tests, they couldn't vote either. So like the actual voting rolls of African Americans started declining until like in the South, there was hardly any that were able to vote because of it. And of course, there was a case, and I'll talk about this briefly about this, but they had what they call grandfather clauses. I don't know if you ever heard about this before, but this helped out like white Southerners. White Southerners that were poor or couldn't read and write. They had a grandfather clause where it said your grandfather could vote back in the 1860s or something like that. You could vote. And so that's how a lot of the poor white Southerners were able to vote because of that. So it's kind of a little sneaky thing they did with that. And so that happened with that as an example. And then, of course, the other thing that happened too was they passed all these Jim Crow laws, these segregation laws, where they segregated people in the South, where you had segregated rooms, segregated restaurants, segregated stores, segregated buses and trains, different like water fountains for whites and blacks. It was ridiculous what they did with this throughout the South. There are, of course, constant signs, of course, everywhere, and like they even had African Americans had to go to their own separate places. Like if you wanted to go to the movies, you had to go to a separate theater that was black, and then you had one for the whites that they had. Restaurant, you couldn't go into a restaurant and eat unless it was African American. I'll give you an example. I'm talking about my uncle who lived in Natchez. This is in the 1940s, I think it is. He was well. I'm Jewish. My uncle he owned a nightclub in Natchez, and it was for African Americans, for colored people, basically. He actually, I don't know what the name of the nightclub was, but he actually ran a nightclub for them. So a lot of these whites would do that sometimes, like especially Jews. They would create these businesses to help out African Americans, whatever. And that was an example of that, So like nightclubs, restaurants were, separate for like blacks and whites, et cetera. Oh, why they called Jim Crow laws? I don't know if you've heard the story about this, but there was like these minstrel shows that they used to put on in the South. They were called Jim Crow minstrels. And these white characters would paint their face black. If you know about that, blackface, whatever they call it. And they would make fun of African Americans. It was kind of like satire. And so the term Jim Crow, and I think it was a song. What was the song called? They had some kind of song that was popular called Jump Jim Crow that went back to the 1830s. And so the term Jim Crow was later used to describe segregation in the South and also in the North that occurred in the United States. I think in the North they had it too, segregation. A lot of businesses and public places were segregated as well. I think there's another sign right here. Oh, yes, segregated schools. So all the schools were segregated up to like the 1950s and 60s in the South for a long time. I think in the North they weren't. They were desegregated, no. In the South they had that. They were supposed to be separate but equal, but as you know, a lot of the ones and the South were not. So a lot of the African Americans didn't get the best education like the whites did in the South. For a long time, it was like that. Thought I had some signs in there too. And I guess that's some of the main ones that I had. And they had, of course, there was, of course, a court case everybody's heard of, which is Plessy versus Ferguson, which was in 1896. It was a Supreme Court case, very important. It basically legalized segregation throughout the United States. It was about this African American named Homer Plessy in Louisiana, and he tried to test the segregation laws that were there in Louisiana. So he bought a ticket and he tried to sit in the first class seating where the whites were instead of the colored area. And he got arrested, and it became a big court case. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1896, in Plessy versus Ferguson, he ruled that separate but equal policies was legal in America. And so that allowed, all these laws to become pretty much the norm from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. And Plessy was only 1/8 black. It's weird about that. But that's what happened. So that gave it teeth, basically, segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson. And so that's how everything became segregated, over time with all these Jim Crow laws. So, yeah, that's where it came from, the whole Jim Crow thing with all these minstrel shows that vaudeville, I guess, whatever they called it, that were put on a long time ago. So anyway, let me go ahead and review some of the material that we've covered so far this week. I forgot one more thing we need to talk about. I forgot about what was the black reaction, African American reaction against Jim Crow. We need to get that one more thing. I'll talk about that, and that's it. Of course, yeah, a lot of black Southerners had different reactions to it. Booker T. Washington, WEB Du Bois, those were the two leading voices for African Americans in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And I'll kind of talk about each one of them. There's Washington on the left, Du Bois on the right. They're pretty important figures. And they were totally different in what they wanted to do. And Booker T was an ex-slave. He was from Virginia. And he had been educated through vocational training, through some kind of skilled type job training. And he believed that was the key to African Americans being successful and eventually getting equality. They thought that they would get graduate equality if they got educated and had a good skill and people would respect them and all that. And he later moved to Alabama, and he helped set up what they call the Tuskegee Institute, which is now called Tuskegee University in Alabama. And it received a lot of white support, which is true. But a lot of African Americans were kind of suspect about it. And they thought Washington was some kind of Uncle Tom that was kind of trying to play up to the whites and all that. But there's a lot of respect for Washington because of some of the stuff he was trying to do. He was trying to get African Americans to get educated, get some kind of skill so they could have some kind of, jobs in the South, which was mostly agriculture. And so Tuskegee, was mostly set up as an A&M type school, if you know about it later on. He was famous for a book he wrote, which was called Up From Slavery, which was published in 1901. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois was totally different. He was highly educated from Western Massachusetts. If you know about Du Bois, he was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, even has some degrees from Germany at one point. He was very educated. He believed liberal arts or any kind of degree you want, that's something that they should, try to strive for, African Americans. He also thought they should strive to get equality. If it meant voicing that, trying to get more rights through, civil rights movements and stuff like that. That was basically what they should do. So he thought, Washington was like an Uncle Tom, trying to do this other stuff over here, whereas Du Bois thought that they should try to get more equality, strive for it in civil rights movements, and try to get a high education. He also wrote a series of essays that's called The Souls of Black Folk, which is well known. Du Bois is very important because, in 1905, he would set up what they call the Niagara Movement, which was a movement to give African Americans political, civil, social rights in the United States. And it was different from Booker T, because Booker had wanted just them to kind of compromise with whites and just go along with whatever they wanted. And so it marked the beginning of the NAACP being founded, which is, of course, the National Association for the Advancements of Colored People. And so their whole manifesto, which was written 1905 at Niagara Falls in New York, basically strived to get full civil liberties for African Americans, abolish racial discrimination like segregation, and recognize human brotherhood, not just with other blacks, but also other races as well. So there were some whites that got involved in this, if you know about it. I think there were even some Jews that got involved as well. And so that NAACP was one of the first civil rights type organizations to try to get more rights for African Americans, which that'll expand more after World War II. So that's it for that lecture-wise. Let me do a quick review real quick before we go today. And of course, I talked about, I think the first thing we discussed was military, Reconstruction. I mentioned how the radical Republicans in Congress basically passed this radical Reconstruction plan. And what that, of course, did was it forced the southern states to accept the 14th Amendment. It also deprived ex-Confederates of a right to vote, drafted constitutions in favor of African Americans, political power. They, of course, in the end, had to ratify the 14th Amendment. That was one of the key things. Later, the 15th Amendment also as well. So basically, radical Reconstruction was more harsher, but it would only last about 10 years. Then remember, Andrew Johnson got impeached in 1868 because of the Tenure of Office Act. And of course, I told you Johnson was impeached because he was trying to stop radical Reconstruction, which the Republicans were trying to control in the South. And they fired him because he tried to fire the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And so they brought him up on charges of impeachment. A lot of it was political because Johnson wanted more of a lenient Reconstruction, and they wanted more of a stronger radical type Reconstruction. And so it ended up, remember, coming to a vote in May of 1868. And remember, by one vote, it failed, and he was found not guilty. Then I told you how in 1868, the Republicans picked Ulysses S. Grant to run for president. He was a war hero. I told you, ran on several slogans, which, of course, the main one that was famous was "Vote as you shot," or the other one I told you what was "Let us have peace." And I had to tell you, he ran against Horatio Seymour, was this wealthy ex-governor of New York. They picked him, but he lost because Grant was a war hero, and then basically they told everybody, "Hey, vote for me because we won the war," waving the bloody shirt. And so that's why he ends up winning. And I told you he also won because of the African-American vote. Of course, later on, they had to pass the 15th Amendment, which will try to solidify that. But I told you about that already. That gave African-American males the right to vote originally. Then I told you about in the South how they had the different groups that tried to control it. Carpetbaggers, Scalawags were the main ones that tried to control the South during military Reconstruction. Carpetbaggers were Northern Republicans that were white mostly. that tried to control the South. And Scalawags were like these native-born white Republicans that had supported the North. They both tried to control the South as the whole politically. I told you carpetbaggers were more dominant. They controlled most of the political offices. And African Americans also controlled it as well. There was some, like a small amount that actually were in power. I told you about like Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. And I told you about PBS Pinchback as examples. Then we talked about the Ku Klux Klan. It was one of several of these white supremacy secret societies in the South that tried to take over. And they were trying to get political rights back. And so they threatened carpetbaggers, scalawags, African Americans. I told you they dressed up like ghosts to try to scare people. And they had all kinds of intimidation tactics, which even included lynchings of people. The Force Acts, which were called all kinds of names, military enforcement acts, those were passed by the Congress with Grant. What that did was it basically used military force of U.S. troops to crack down on the Ku Klux Klan and other secret societies to try and basically break it, which they did. So the Ku Klux Klan declined afterwards. And the Amnesty Act also helped to cause the decline of the Ku Klux Klan because that gave a lot of political rights back to a lot of ex-Confederates, although it did exclude like Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, that were kind of at the top in the old Confederacy. Then I tell you about the New South. That was the nickname for the South from the 1870s to like World War I. It was a nickname which they called it that because of the development of like new industries, but it was still based on agriculture. And a lot of the type of farming was dominated by mostly two types, tenant farming versus sharecropping. What's the difference? Tenant farming is where an owner of a land would rent land to people, and they had to provide their own equipment. Sharecropping was where a landowner basically gave someone a piece of land to work, but they had to still get everything from the owner, whether it be the crop seed, equipment, horses, mules, and they would get a share of the crop after the harvest was over. And sharecropping was the most dominant thing in the South. And I told you, like a lot of African Americans, that was majority of the kind of farmer that they were, like 80% or more. Then I think one more thing here. Of course, then we talked about the fact that in the South, disenfranchisement of blacks followed next, of course. And of course, a lot of the southern states passed a lot of different laws and constitutions to do this. Poll taxes, where they had a head tax, basically, on people to vote. Literacy tests, had to be able to read and write to vote. Now, I told you there was a grandfather clause that was used to help out poor white Southerners predominantly. Like if they couldn't vote or hold office, etc. If they had a grandfather that did, they could. So kind of sneaky what they did with that. And then like in the South, they had the Jim Crow laws in the South. You know, they began segregating everything. I told you, from schools to restaurants to hotels to bars, movie theaters, buses, trains, you name it, separate water fountains. And I told you the term Jim Crow originated from Jim Crow minstrels and all that were popular in the South. And Plessy versus Ferguson was the main court case in 1896, you know, that gave strength to segregation and made it legal throughout the United States. And that would make Jim Crow laws pretty much dominant until like the 1950s and 60s. And I'll tell you, the last thing I mentioned earlier was that there were different reactions to what happened in the New South with these changes. Actually, some African Americans left. I don't know if you know about this. They went up north. Some went out west. Like some African Americans even became cowboys and stuff like that. But like Booker T. Washington, WEB Du Bois had different views on what they wanted to do in the South. Washington wanted more vocational type education for African Americans, where they could get a skill, and that would lead to more equality. And then W.B. Du Bois thought they should get like more traditional liberal arts degrees and other kinds of degrees. If you want to be a lawyer, a doctor, you can be a doctor. He thought that would then lead to them getting more rights. And then they also thought that they should strive for civil rights movements to try to get more rights. Booker, of course, was famous for setting up Tuskegee Institute, now called University in Alabama, and that was one of the first African-American type schools that was like an A&M type school, like Southern University or whatever. And so he helped to kind of develop it. And Washington was famous for a book he wrote, which was called Up from Slavery, because he was an ex-slave that had become successful in the South. And W.B. Du Bois was famous for his series of essays called The Souls of Black Folk. Last thing I talked about was the rise of the NAACP, of course, Niagara Movement. That was a civil rights movement that was started by W.B. Du Bois and other people that wanted to try to give equality to African Americans. And the National Association of Advancements of Colored People, get that messed up, formed in 1905. And it's, of course, considered one of the first civil rights movements that'll come along, and that's going to strive to get equal rights for African Americans. But this is going to take a while. It's going to take maybe 50 years or more for that to take off. But eventually, it will come to fruition, but over a long period of time. So, in the end, the Reconstruction itself was a failure. That's the one thing you've got to understand about Reconstruction, in the end, was that it didn't really work out like they thought it would. The Northerners, in Congress, like the Republicans, thought that they would be able to fix everything, but they couldn't. And part of the reason for that was the fact that in the North, they were more concerned about industrialization. They were trying to go into westward expansion towards like California, trying to build the railroad, like the Transcontinental Railroad, and all these other things that were kind of going on at the same time. And so a lot of people just weren't interested in trying to fix all the problems of the South. And a lot of this would take a long time for it to actually be fixed, like up to like almost recently in the last so many years. Like even desegregation went on, just dragged on forever, like with the schools and stuff like that now. Anyway, so that's pretty much it for Reconstruction. Now, on Thursday, I will be moving on to talk about the Gilded Age. We'll kind of talk about all the corruption that happened, especially under Grant's administration. And I'll talk about how I think the big thing coming up later is going to be I'll talk about Gilded Age politics. If I have any time, I'll talk about the Old West, which is one thing that gets settled during the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. That's it for today. If you have any questions about this lecture, let me know. Send me any questions, comments that you have overall about the lecture. Remember, you do get bonus points for talking about for asking me questions and comments about the lecture. I think it's 2 or 3 bonus points through YouTube. So send me comments, questions about the lecture. I hope you like the little intro video. I'm going to try to do a little intro video every day when we do have a lecture for class. I think no class is Monday next week because of Labor Day. I don't know if y'all do anything for that. But reminder, like I said, there's a Canvas quiz on Reconstruction. See quizzes. Make sure you get that finished by next Tuesday. Due Tuesday, I think September 8th. And then also I had reminded y'all earlier that if anybody has a topic for their, research paper, let me know. Email me about that. I don't know if anybody has the contract policy page not still turned in. I think everybody's turned that in just about. Send that to me. And then if anybody's also lastly interested in the Veterans Oral History Project, email me, okay? I've got about 10 people signed up so far. So if you're interested in that and know a veteran that you want to interview, family, friend, let me know about that. So that's it for today. I hope you all have a great evening. I'll see you on Thursday. So send me comments, if you questions, if you got something about the lecture, you do get bonus for that.